Wait, hold on.
Did a gringo from Nashville
Really become president of parts of Mexico and all of Nicaragua? Did this really happen? If so, how did it happen? When did it happen? And if so, who was the mysterious person? What became of him? Hello again, friends, and welcome to Lost and Unfound, where we tell the true tales of the formerly famous, the infamous, and the forgotten. I'm Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. A few years ago, maybe more than that, I found myself in a Nicaraguan steakhouse with family and friends in my hometown of Miami. On the wall was an old black and white portrait of a man that seemed out of time and out of place, but was somehow vaguely familiar. I asked the waiter, who was this person on the wall, and why did his portrait hang in such an establishment? He assured me that the man in the frame was none other than Johnny Walker, the namesake of the legendary Scotch whiskey brand. Black, blue, red, however you like it. Now, this was not Johnny Walker, and in full disclosure, I know this image far too well, even if sometimes through double vision. But my dining companions and I still couldn't quite place this faded and forlorn-looking fellow. Well, soon afterward, the owner of the place emerged from the kitchen to tell us that indeed our cynical suspicions were well-founded. The surname of the mystery man in the frame was in fact Walker. However, his given name was not Johnny, but not only was this guy not the namesake of an internationally renowned brand of scotch, he was known to have probably never even tasted that libation. This Mr. Walker is a fascinating apparition of history, and though virtually lost to memory in his native country, that being the United States, he remains controversial to this day in parts of Mexico and especially in Central America. So we'll do our best to tell his fascinating story and bring him back to life here. The man in the portrait on the wall was William Walker, a journalist, a lawyer, and a physician. But what brought him infamy was not his early avocations and achievements, but his later career that was far more interesting and complicated and dramatic. He would go on to even more lofty stations as El Presidente of Nicaragua, as well as other short stints in the same self-proclaimed capacity in two regions of Mexico, Baja California and Sonora states. So let's delve deeper into William Walker, the so-called gray-eyed man, who would briefly become the unlikely president of these fragile new republics. William Walker was born into a family of relative privilege, I guess, in Nashville, Tennessee in May of 1824. His father was a Scottish immigrant, while his mother's roots stretched far back for generations into the American colonies. From his maternal line, he counted prominent ancestors that had served on the independence side during the Revolutionary War. He was also the nephew of John Norval, who was one of Michigan's first U.S. senators, as well as the founder of the Philadelphia Inquirer, among the country's most illustrious and storied newspapers. He appears to have been a child prodigy of sorts, graduating the head of his class from the now-defunct University of Nashville, also called Cumberland College, at the age of 14. 14. Now, we always have to be a little circumspect of the details of academic credentials of the era, especially in a place like Nashville, which was essentially a frontier town at the time of his studies there. But he was off to the Ivy League next to study medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, where he received his medical degree at the age of 19. Now, that is very impressive, but how would you like to have a 19-year-old working on you, scalpel in hand? From there, he made his way to Britain and continental Europe, where he continued his medical studies at Edinburgh and Heidelberg, respectively. Now back in Philadelphia, where he briefly practiced his trade, he seems to have either been bored or unsuccessful or both, and he hightails it to New Orleans, this time to study the law. But just as he had done with medicine, he soon abandons his latest professional pursuit and then turns to journalism, where he was appointed editor of the New Orleans Crescent. And during his brief stint in the Big Easy, he interestingly hired a northern contemporary who would go on to become one of the country's most renowned poets, and that was none other than Walt Whitman. But once again, this restless ADD-afflicted young man is on the move, this time to San Francisco in 1849, where he finds work as the editor of the San Francisco Herald, right at the heart of the California gold rush. He quickly made some serious enemies, though, in his latest adopted hometown, and this stemmed from his scathing editorials that sought to expose the massive graft and corruption in the young, bustling town. These bold and daring exposés led him to being challenged to organize duels on at least 3 occasions, 2 of which were where he found himself injured. So as our story rolls on, keep in mind that these early skirmishes seem to portend a bad harbinger for his next career move. The duel that we have the clearest record of was fought with a man called William Hicks Graham. Some reports refer to him as a gunslinger, which sounds fun. Others as a law clerk. Not so fun. Graham seems to have been both, and this happened in 1851. In any regard, this was a challenge that Walker should not have RSVP'd to, as he was shot twice without ever hitting his opponent a single time. Though seriously injured, he was able to convalesce and survived. Graham was briefly arrested and quickly released. After dusting himself off and tending to his wounds, it was in San Francisco where his life would truly take the wild twists and turns that would define him for the rest of his days. While still working as a journalist there, he begins to hatch plans to become a so-called filibuster or freebooter, probably a concept that he had toyed with for years before. Now we have to take a brief look at what these mostly forgotten terms meant during the years in which he lived and died. Today the term is known in U.S. politics on both sides of the aisle to mean a protracted and sometimes almost masturbatory effort to delay a vote on the Senate floor to promote or prevent a bill from becoming law. To date, the longest filibuster in the Senate was delivered by the once ardent segregationist former governor, presidential candidate, and South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond. And this happened in 1957, and it lasted for over 24 hours. Now, never mind that this guy fathered a mixed-race daughter out of wedlock, but that's a different show. I think it's funny to note that this ranting and raving has been described as a kind of urological mystery, as the rules require that the person speaking must not abandon the dais during the speech. I think Strom had a contraption that prevented him from doing so. Well, anyway, the term filibuster had an entirely different meaning 100 or so years before. Filibuster is derived from the Spanish filibustero, if I have that right, which itself was a bastardized version of an earlier Dutch word that I won't even dare to pronounce, but holds the same meaning. Freebooter is the anglicized or Americanized equivalent. So what was a filibuster or a freebooter in Walker's era? Well, though the terms have been alternately linked throughout time to earlier privateers and even modern-day mercenaries, it's really a category unto itself. Let's put it as country simple as best we can. Privateers were semi-autonomous sailors akin to pirates who carried out military operations against foreign enemies on the high seas at the behest of their sovereign. Some of the more notable privateers of their day that may be familiar to some in the audience were the likes of Sir Francis Drake, Henry Morgan, and Jean Lafitte, as well as William Dampier, the latter of whom we've dedicated a whole show to on this channel, so we hope you'll check that one out. Mercenaries, on the other hand, were and are essentially hired guns to launch foreign military missions in the employ of a government or an organization. This is typically done on land. A few examples that jump to mind are the German Hessian brigades that fought with the British during the American War of Independence, and in more current times, the notoriously brutal Russian-controlled Wagner Group, which still operates today, mostly in Africa and Ukraine. There are, of course, many others that have come before and since. Freebooters were different in that they were self-financed, and rather than looting or pillaging, their primary purpose was to export, with armed force, strongly held political, cultural, colonial, and sometimes religious ambitions to nascent and fragile foreign nations or quasi-states. Though some consider them imperialists, I think expansionists is a more fitting term. And to that point, we have to throw one more term out there that is fundamental to our story, and that is the concept of manifest destiny. For those that may be unfamiliar with the concept and its general meaning, we'll cut to the chase and provide a very cursory explanation here. Manifest destiny, though not codified by any specific definition or allegiance, was a widely shared and heartfelt belief in the 19th century United States, particularly in the antebellum South. It is a uniquely American term, coined by a Confederate apologist named John O'Sullivan. It essentially advocates the idea of American exceptionalism and its unfettered extension across the Americas as to expand the perceived values and virtues as expressed by the founders of the United States. Though we always aim to steer clear of political bias on this channel, it is an inarguably expansionist concept and did not really recognize boundaries as we know them today. It really harkens back to the Louisiana Purchase under President Thomas Jefferson, whereby the United States virtually doubled its size for the cost of a mansion in New York or London or wherever today. We see it in Texas as well with the fight at the Alamo and the Mexican-American War that ensued following that tragic and dramatic and romantic event. But there were other places, even more obscure, on this unwritten map that were ripe for the taking. So enough with the lecture, and after a short break, let's get back to the star of the show, where we tell the wild story of where William Walker goes and what he does next. After raising funds and scattered troops, he expectedly set his sights on the occupation of the very ill-defined and loosely governed Mexican states of Sonora and Baja California, which straddle the borders of California and Arizona and Mexico today. This very large region was very sparsely settled at the time, and though technically Mexican territory, it was really a no man's land with very nominal governance or military fortification. To provide some quick historical perspective, the combined territories of what we now know as Sonora and Baja California probably contained a total population of around 250,000 inhabitants during Walker's time, compared to an estimated 8 to 10 million people today. Walker, along with a friend and business partner named Henry Watkins, first set their sights on Sonora State and were granted permission to travel there by the Mexican consulate in San Francisco, where they arrived in the summer of 1853. Their disembarkation point was the port town of Guaymas, ostensibly to offer the de facto leaders of the state protection from marauding bands of native Apache tribes that were perhaps understandably wreaking havoc on the local pueblos. Their ask was to trade protection in return for untold amounts of unsettled land with which to found a new colony to be called the Republic of Sonora. Now, it is true that Indian raids in this region had claimed the lives of thousands of settlers. There was very little defense in the form of an organized military to repel them. But suspicious of his wider designs, the local would-be authorities rejected his proposal, and he soon returned north, having failed to secure any sort of diplomatic agreement. But this would not deter him, as he vowed that on his next return to Mexico, it would not be with pen and parchment, but with military force. And he did just that. Back in San Francisco, he hastily recruited a ragtag band of 45 fellow travelers, most of whom hailed from the South, and it seems many were broke 49ers who had failed to secure their pot of gold during the gold rush. Just a few months later, this motley crew made their way to the outpost of La Paz in Baja California, where they quickly took it over and Walker declared himself president. His buddy Henry Watkins vice president. He also declared the entire region was to be governed by the precepts of the Louisiana Constitution, which of course provided for slavery, the vile institution that had been officially forbidden in Mexico since that country's very complicated independence from Spain. Though he took this outpost with little or no resistance, the central government soon caught wind of this, and federales were on the move to retake the town from the Gringo raiders. Fearing the worst and struggling desperately for supplies, the freebooters retreated slowly north, first to Cabo San Lucas, then to Ensenada, and then running for their lives back to California. And this sounds like a spring break expedition today. Now, back once again to familiar soil, he was greeted to what has to be called a complicated reception. He was cheered by most of his adopted hometown as a bold and daring freedom fighter, but he was soon arrested and indicted by a grand jury for violating the Neutrality Act of 1794, which had been passed under the administration of none other than George Washington, which was aimed precisely at guys like Walker. This law, which has been revised many times since original passage, essentially prevents American citizens from engaging in foreign wars beyond the purview of the U.S. government. It reads in part, and I won't bore you here, I hope, quote, "If any person within the territory or jurisdiction of the United States begin or set on foot or provide or prepare the means for any military expedition or enterprise against the territory or dominions of any foreign prince or state of whom the United States was at peace, that person would be guilty of a misdemeanor." A misdemeanor? Well, here comes the verdict. It took the jury 8 minutes to acquit him of the charges. He was set free to the rousing cheers of the local populace. Now, I'm guessing his reception would be a little bit different in San Francisco today. And thus ended his fixations and flirtations with Mexico. But he was not done filibustering. In fact, you could argue he was just getting into full stride. So after another quick pause, let's learn about his movements in a nearby place that would make him infamous, but where he would ultimately pen his final and fatal chapter. In what goes down to history as the Filibuster War, Walker looks next to another fractured place south of the border, and that was Nicaragua. Not only was that new republic anarchic, following colonial Spanish rule, it was geographically vital to the shipping lanes between the east and west coasts of the United States, those being the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, the largest bodies of water in the world. This country also found itself in a civil war and a very complicated situation regarding its then vital shipping routes, both of which come into play very shortly. Walker found an invitation there from a man named Francisco Castillon, at the behest of another American filibuster, Byron Cole, an expat of similar sentiment then resident in the country. Castillon was the de facto leader of the so-called democratic or liberal forces of that new nation, and he rolled out the red carpet to Walker and his would-be Yankee colonists to join in their fight against the so-called legitimists or conservative forces. At the time of Walker's arrival, the conservatives were under the brief leadership of Fruto Chamorro, whose progeny counts 3 presidents of that country, most recently Violeta Chamorro, who served as its first and to date only female president in the 1990s, following the fall of the Sandinistas. Well, for those who are familiar with Nicaragua, have they really ever fallen? In May of 1855, Walker, and this time with 60 men in tow, arrived in Nicaragua and were joined by 100 or so of those loyal to Castillon. Among Walker's crew now were other complicated and colorful adventurers and filibusters of their day. Charles Weber, Chatham Wheat, and Charles Henningsen, all of whom had seen fighting for various causes in exotic parts of the globe. These guys were all trained in military matters who, contrary to Walker, and despite his haughty, self-designated titles, possessed no military experience whatsoever. Also with them were 2 men who would go on to survive this adventure, Burkett Fry and Robert Tyler, both of whom would later become prominent in the Confederate military. Tyler didn't last so long, as he goes down as a footnote of being the final general killed on the battlefield in the American Civil War. As was the case in Mexico, Walker's small band was initially unsuccessful. They were routed at the small port town of Rivas, taking numerous casualties, among them Walker loyalists Major Lieutenant Colonel Achilles Kewen and Major Timothy Crocker, both of whom had participated in the failed Sonora campaign. It is said that as he lay dying, Crocker fired a futile shot at Walker and cursed him for being dragged into another doomed plot as the latter rode on to temporary glory. So once again, the gray-eyed man dodges another bullet. But he and his small company licked their wounds and were back again. And this time they struck pay dirt at the so-called Battle of Virgin Bay, where they routed their opponents, killing 60 and losing just 2 in the skirmish. This modest victory, coupled with his surprisingly humane treatment of the surviving opponents, greatly buoyed Walker and his followers in the region. And soon fresh local recruits eagerly joined the forces of the liberal side, as well as 35 more new recruits from San Francisco. Roughly a month later, in October of 1855, the filibusters and their liberal allies finally took siege of the capital city of Granada after a protracted battle with the Legitimists in which hundreds on both sides were killed. This fight ended in victory for Walker and his allies, essentially handing them control of the entire country. But not before, under Walker's orders, Colonel Henningsen, as alluded to earlier, essentially burned the old Spanish colonial town to the ground, infamously leaving a sign amongst the smoldering ruins which read, "Aquí fue Granada." Translation, "Here was Granada." So now Walker was El Jefe, and he carefully assembled various toadies to construct a, quote, unified government amongst the warring factions. But make no mistake, he was the puppet master now of this splintered and fractured country. Now in control, albeit briefly, he almost immediately moved to reinstitute slavery and encourage Norte Americanos to settle in the country, some of whom did. As was more famously the case with the annexation of Mexico, the slavery divide, and also a suspicion of, if not hostility to, the local Catholic population by the Protestant interlopers raised the ire of many of the local residents suspicious of their designs. So now Walker's Napoleonic movements pitted him against much of the local peasantry as well as heavy-handed interests in the United States and the dictators of the surrounding new republics of Central America. Nevertheless, almost exactly a year following his arrival in the country, the American president of the day, Franklin Pierce, recognized Walker as the legitimate president of Nicaragua. Of course, he had no legal right to do that, but a month or so later, Walker did officially hand himself that very title. But not so fast, President Pierce or President Walker. His opposing political factions in the U.S. refused to accept Walker's choice as emissary. Parker French, a known swindler and all-around scoundrel who was arguably even more controversial than Walker himself. There was also a very pivotal character that would enter this scene, and that was the railroad and shipping magnate, Cornelius Vanderbilt, known as the Commodore, perhaps one of the wealthiest men in the world at that time. Old Corny controlled the crude but very profitable shipping lanes that were the shortest route between the Atlantic and Pacific prior to the construction of the Panama Canal that would be built decades later. This was an arduous and complicated passage, which involved embarkation and disembarkation from both coasts at several points across Lake Nicaragua, but nevertheless was far more efficient than the time-consuming ancient route around Cape Horn. Vanderbilt controlled virtually all movement of this route, which greatly lined his already very fat pockets. Vanderbilt and his legitimist stooges in the region controlled this precarious passage with an iron fist, and as such were fiercely suspicious of an interloper from Tennessee encroaching on their monopoly. Now we have to take a quick pause here, and it'll be very quick, to mention a late 1980s film starring Ed Harris and directed by Alex Cox that purports to tell this story in film. But it is so laughably bad as to deserve no further comment. And if you really find this very interesting, go watch that movie, or maybe not. Well, interstage right, the president, really the dictator of Costa Rica, Juan Rafael Mora Porras, began making bellicose speeches directed at the peculiar new government next door. Soon war was imminent again, and Walker arranged an international battalion of around 250 men under arms this time, composed of American, French, German, and local militia to prepare for battle. They were called the American Phalanx. Sure enough, another skirmish came at what is known as the Battle of Santa Rosa, and that occurred in March of 1856 along the border of the two countries. Each side suffered around 50 casualties, but it was unquestionably a victory for the Costa Ricans as the various combatants under Walker's command fled back to their recently claimed turf after the dust had settled. The next fighting takes place a matter of weeks later in what is known as the Second Battle of Rivas. This time the Costa Ricans and recruits from neighboring countries brought a much greater fighting force, numbering in the thousands. This was again arguably a victory for Mura and his forces, which brought with it hundreds of more casualties on either side. But this temporary win would come at a far greater loss, for reasons that surmounted those that died on the field. The corpses of those killed in action on both sides were summarily cast into nearby rivers and wells, which would in due course lead to a cholera epidemic, which would decimate the entire country of Costa Rica. and by definition lead to the eventual deaths of 1/10 of its civilian population. Some of Walker's troops also succumbed to the same fate, and this led to further desertions from his beleaguered forces. While those that were still alive were not happy, to say the least, to most of the locals, the Gringos had overstayed their welcome. Soon a loosely organized force of the surrounding Central American nations, numbering again in the thousands, closed in on the invaders under the leadership of the Honduran Florencio Chatruch. These forces were heavily financed by Vanderbilt and his powerful allies in the region. Many pitched battles were fought over the ensuing months, with no obvious victory on either side. But Walker's time was up for the time being, and he seems to have known it. With many of his men dead or deserted, and the powers that be, both within the region and outside it, virtually opposed to him, he abdicated his dubious presidency of Nicaragua and accepted an offer from U.S. Navy Commander Charles Henry Davis for free and safe return for himself and his remaining troops back to the United States in May of 1857. In their wake, the most reliable numbers were roughly 1,000 of Walker's men killed in battle or by disease, and probably 6 to 8 times as many casualties of the various factions that sought to repel him. Not to mention the countless others that succumbed to the cholera epidemic, which was wrought by the invasion. We'll never know the real numbers. Now back briefly in his home country, he was again met with mixed reviews. Generally revered as a proto-Confederate icon in the South and the West, and an opportunistic scoundrel in the North. Within mere months after his repatriation, he was not quite done with Central America, and he set his sights back to that area, and he returned there with a small force of true believers. But this stunt failed even more miserably, and he was hastily arrested soon after disembarkation by American naval authorities in the region for once again violating the Neutrality Act. So, how many times do you have to be rejected? Well, he's sent packing once again, this time with no shots having been fired. So back in the U.S. for the final time, he claimed to have embraced Catholicism in a laughable attempt to endear himself to the communities in Central America that he had sought to rule once again. This was the same ploy, by the way, attempted by many or most of the founders of the Lone Star Republic a generation before in Mexico. They had agreed to abandon their deeply held Protestant faith and their advocacy of slavery in exchange for access to land and power, only to renege on these promises as soon as they had gained control. Walker took a page out of the same playbook, but as we will soon learn, the results were not what he had planned. During his banishment back to the States, he penned his memoirs called The War in Nicaragua, which is essentially his attempt to justify filibusterism and his notorious role in that movement. But there's one final clarion call that comes his way, and that was from the mostly Anglo settlers in the Bay Islands off the coast of Honduras, who sought his assistance in fending off hostile power on the mainland. The Bay Islands, the capital is Roatan, some of you may have been there or might be familiar with that, is a multi-ethnic hodgepodge that during Walker's time was mostly comprised of settlers from the Cayman Islands and the former British Honduras, now Belize. It's a beautiful and complicated little tiny sliver of the world, and if you get a chance, you should visit. Like so much of the Caribbean, the Bay Islands had been kicked around like a football by various European countries for centuries, and its jurisdictional status was in perpetual dispute. Well, anxious to get back into action, he takes up the call and sets sail there in 1860, only to once again be quickly apprehended, this time by the British, who were equally suspicious of Walker's movements in the region. They viewed him as a threat to their admittedly thin colonial presence in Central America. He was taken into custody by the eventual Admiral of the Fleet, Sir Noel Salmon, who personally escorted the hapless freebooter to the regional capital of Trujillo to stand trial for the crimes of piracy and filibusterism. I don't know about piracy, but I guess it's hard to argue that he was innocent of filibusterism, as he was, of course, the poster child of that movement. Well, the verdict was as predictable as the sentence: guilty and death by execution. On September 12th of 1860, Walker was led to his death to face the firing squad. His purported last words were spoken in both English and Spanish, and they were, quote, "Other walkers shall arise from my blood."
This concludes the latest episode of Lost and Unfound. Keep watching on YouTube or find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the socials. New episodes drop regularly. And if you like what you see, please subscribe. It really does help us create new and fresh content. And be sure to check out our companion site, Well Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. Copyright Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.